Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
I don't know about you, Curtis. It could be a wet and miserable bank holiday weekend ahead of us, but let's hope
it's brewing up, isn't it? Yeah, it's certainly looking that way. And there's some horrendous traffic reports for Saturday. That's supposed to be the worst day on the roads for traffic. So,
is the train strikes again or anything? I'm not sure.
Oh, I expect so.
Somewhere disrupting something somewhere.
Yeah.
But no, 3 days of bank holiday.
Yeah, if you are listening on the M25 on Saturday, I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope it's a welcome distraction.
Yes. And if you are in the M25, then we've got a story for you later on that you may need to think about going forward. But we'll get to that one later on.
Yeah, and it's guaranteed to put a smile on your face as well.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got a few shout-outs to start off with, and what a fantastic interview with Simon Bist, head of sales at BYD, and I think it's probably been one of the most popular midweek interviews recently.
Yeah.
We've had some good, strong midweek interviews, but I think this one has really caught the attention of the listeners this week, Curtis.
Yeah, Simon was incredibly open. So we learnt a lot about the rollout of BYD, its ambitions in terms of sales, which surprised me because that was quite revealing. Because I won't give away the full story, but Simon actually says what percentage of the EV market BYD is actually targeting. He gave us some details on the dealer network rollout as well, because that's pretty ambitious, isn't it? 100 dealers in 2 years, and they're well on the way already.
Yeah, definitely. So if you haven't listened to it, I know we shared a clip last Saturday, and the whole interview was shared on Tuesday morning of this week. So if you haven't listened, then you just have a listen, put it in perspective a bit of what is coming, and a bit of background behind BYD, who they are, where they're coming from, and some of the ambitions for the brand in the UK, Europe, and other markets. So do have a listen to that in your podcast feed.
And talking of weekday interviews, look out for our interview next week with CAP HPI's Darren Martin. Yeah, it's come around. It's that time of the month when we look at values. So Darren will be giving us the full lowdown on how August performed. So looking forward to that. Yeah,
definitely. And we've got a Menable this week again. So we're joined again by our friend Stephen Whitten. And so midway break, we'll be sharing the chat there with Stephen Whitten, and this will resonate with majority of the car dealers, the retailers listening this morning, because he makes some very obvious observations, should we say, Curtis, in terms of stereotyping.
Yeah, it is an interesting and very relevant and topical one. So do stay tuned for that. We've got some shout outs for some industry events. So in case these aren't on your calendar already, AM Live is coming up. So that's on the 9th of November at the Birmingham NEC. So online bookings are open. I actually booked my place this week and shared it on LinkedIn and had quite a few likes and reshares.
Mr. Godfather's join you for a coffee.
He is, yeah. So I look forward to that, Ian. I assume you're buying, in which case I'll have a sticky bun as well. We've also got the Motor Trader Awards coming up soon. So entries for that close on the 15th of September, and the awards night is on the 22nd of November at Grosvenor House. And the last big one at the moment is the Car Dealer Used Car Awards. So entries across 23 categories close on the 1st of October, and the awards night is in London on the 27th of November. So do check out those three key events.
Are you still supporting if anybody does want any help with awards entries, Curtis? Or
I can do, yeah. Time is running
I'm
out,
thinking of your
so
capacity and time lines. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, if you are thinking of entering the Motor Trade Awards, then yeah, do get in touch with me. You can find me on LinkedIn, and we can have a chat.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
So headlines this week are from Car Dealer, AM, Auto Retail Agenda, Leasing Broker News, and the Daily Telegraph, starting with OEMs should team up with each other amid calls for serious supply chain investment. Ford plans to halve its UK dealer network again. Dealers voice concern over agency and finance sales. New data shows half of company cars delivered in Q1 were fully electric. Stellantis standards blamed for closure of Fiat Alfa and Jeep dealership. And finally, this week, Londoners come up with a classic approach to next week's ULEZ extension.
So heading over to the first story in Car Dealer there, and this is something from the latest Auto Focus, which I'm involved with and help to publish. But really, the content on this is from Owen Edwards at Grant Thornton, who's highlighted that car manufacturers should team up with each other amid calls for serious supply chain investment. And this is looking at the why. As we move towards this electrification, hybrid, and those challenges in the supply chain that we know hit the sector significantly through the pandemic, which was obviously very publicised, particularly on microchips and semiconductors and things like that. That actually, to get around some of these challenges around supply chain is where there should be collaboration between the OEMs.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, isn't it? And of course, we know historically manufacturers do work together behind the scenes because we've seen cars produced on sharing the same platform, but being marketed and produced by different brands. So there is a precedent for this. But do you think that they would be open to be sharing more and helping?
I think there is. I think there is. I think one thing that and it is being particularly driven by battery electric vehicles, because we know that there is obviously media reports out there about the cost efficiencies currently around battery electric vehicles, and that some of them are actually loss making for the OEMs because of the cost of material versus low volume of production. But even this week, I think Stellantis have announced that they're going to be looking at partnering with an EV manufacturer for entering China. So they've looked at the Chinese market. They want to look at how they get into the Chinese market. And part of that will be actually, why don't we partner with an EV Chinese manufacturer to get into that marketplace? So I think there is, some of it is about market territory entrance and share, but actually a lot of it is, as Owen does point out, it's about scale. It's about efficiencies, about productivity. And, at what point is a battery electric vehicle in terms of range, charging, good enough? I mean, how fast do you want to go in a battery electric vehicle, and how far do you want to go in a battery electric vehicle? At some point, is the majority, 50% of the vehicle that is made up by the battery and its ancillary components, enough? And then it's a case of look, style, and interior, and that's where that's where you might get the differentiator between manufacturers.
Yeah, and what really interested me in this story is some of Owen's observations about the dilemma facing car manufacturers, these traditional car manufacturers, because they're ramping up BEV production, they're reducing ICE production, but there will come a point, as he points out, that ICE vehicles will become less profitable as BEVs are ramped up and become more profitable. And it's how they address that, how they plan. And, it is a dilemma across the industry, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think we were talking before the show, you've got engine block manufacturers, supply manufacturers that supply, given number of OEMs with the engine blocks for their ICE vehicles, and then obviously everything else happens more locally. But with the drop in share, drop in volume, those engine blocks will become more and more expensive because about productivity and about efficiency. So at what point is that change in that inflection point that actually, as EVs start to increase in volume of productivity, they become more efficient, more cost efficient because production, and then all of a sudden your petrol diesel product becomes more costly because of low volumes, but you're still making them. And this is the dilemma that many OEMs will be facing currently. And, as we sort of think about deadlines, where it's 2030 in the UK, 35 in Europe, and differences in other markets, it starts to change the strategic planning from the OEMs as to what markets they operate within and what product they manufacture.
Yeah, and you can imagine some of the headaches that that difference between 2030 for the UK, 2035 for the rest of Europe is actually causing the manufacturers in terms of production planning. But that's above our pay grade, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll watch this one. But
Yeah.
moving on, but sticking with manufacturers, this is a fantastic story in auto retail agenda, and that Ford plans to have dealer network. And as you pointed out again, because we
Yeah.
know that this was announced not that long ago, really, in the scheme of things.
2020.
Was
So
it
not
as short as
long.
that? So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
2020 that they announced a reduction in their dealership representation in the UK, and they are planning, according to the story, to do it again.
Yeah, so you're right. It was 2020 that the plan was originally. I was going to say announced, but I think it was probably more leaked. But the plan was to cut from 400 to 210 sites, so almost halving it. Now, currently, according to this story, the network stands at 302 retailers, but the story reports that earlier this year, retailers said they were told by Ford that the aim was to actually hit 120 new car sales sites. But however, some businesses have since been told by Ford that this target will actually be overachieved, and the final number could be fewer than 100 showrooms. And this ties in with our good friend agency. This is an agency related story. So Ford is currently trialing its agency plans in the Netherlands ahead of the European rollout, but we don't know when it's coming to the UK. So it's obviously been planned. It is coming, but this is all part of getting the network to the size that Ford feels is the optimum size under agency. But it's worth pointing out that in this story that Ford doesn't recognize these figures. And there's a lovely quote from the spokesperson at Ford who says, "We haven't confirmed any timings around when agency will come to the UK, nor what the size or shape of the network will look like under agency." And it goes on to say, "We don't recognize the numbers that you quoted to us. They have not been communicated by anyone from Ford." So that's the Ford side of the story. Clearly, there is major
Something there,
downsizing going on there. Yeah.
And interestingly, I think you referred to the BYD interview with Simon Biss there, and because they're entering the UK market, and again, not telling you too much about the interview there, but they're entering the UK market in an NSC, National Sales Company kind of format, which is about partnering with existing retailers in the UK, and I think they've done similar across their 16 European markets that they've got. But they've obviously got, I think they quoted 35 outlets currently, with
Yes.
15 partners.
Yeah. And the plan is, Simon shared this with us, to reach 100 dealers in 24 months. So the BYD network, according to this story, could be the same size as the Ford network.
Yeah,
Now,
could have
who
some
would have
blue
thought that?
ovals above the door of that one.
Yes. Yeah.
Just saying. Maybe, yeah, maybe that's what we'll start to see. I mean, we've seen it already, haven't we? But that's where I think a lot of the conversation now, particularly around agency and new entrants, is where some of the retailers are saying, you know what, I don't want agency, that's not for me, and starting to replace certain manufacturers with some of the new entrants and moving. There's a lot of shift taking place, a lot of chess being played at OEM representation and dealer level at the minute in the Curtis.
There certainly is. So moving on to leasing broker news, and the headline there is agency model and availability of motor finance are emerging worries. So this is from the Startline used car tracker, which we kind of reference, I think, most months now. It is a good barometer of what's happening in the industry across franchised and independent dealers. So this is the August used car tracker. And so when dealers were asked about the biggest challenges facing them for the future, the agency model was mentioned by 27% of respondents, and that's apparently the highest monthly figure recorded since that was introduced into the research as recently as January, while the availability of finance was mentioned by 51%. Also, again, that's a new peak for this year.
Yeah, and I think, with this, that there is this view that, as manufacturers move into that agency model, one of the strategic plans for the OEMs in that agency model is about ring fencing their products within that dealer network, that representation network, to stop leakage into other markets, other brands and things like that, which is, to the point that they're trying to make here, that, access to some of these product that you've relied on as either as a multi-franchised used car operator or a supermarket or independent dealer, non-franchise independent dealer. This product, it may be getting more and more challenging to access and to obtain, because as the shift to agency, certain manufacturers saying, you know what, we are cutting off channels where we are not in control of the end use of that vehicle. We want to make sure that vehicle comes back into our ownership, our control, for us to control it within our dealer network. So I think we are going to see this change. It'll take a bit of time, but I think that's where we're going to start to see this change hit the market as we move forward.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because that 27% of respondents, what the story alludes to is it's not necessarily just franchise dealers who are worried and concerned about agency. It's also independents, and there's a good quote from Paul Burgess from Startline, who says the growing worry over the agency model is interesting because at first glance it doesn't directly affect used car dealers. However, and this follows on from your point, there is perhaps a growing level of concern that it could impact on already tight used car supply, with manufacturers using their new agreements to attempt to control vehicles through their second and third lives.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, Jim Farley in the US of Ford, every EV goes back to Ford.
Yes,
they've controlled it in the US that any Ford EV does not go out into the network outside of Ford's control. And that's what many of the OEMs are looking at for the UK. So I think this is certainly going to be one to watch, and one that is probably on the radar for, as Paul has said, for the not just the franchise dealers but also the independent and supermarkets of the marketplace.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed. Next up is our latest Menable Moment, looking at mental health and well-being awareness, issues and best practices across the automotive sector, with me, Stephen Whitten. Yeah, hi everyone, it's Menable Moments time, and how are you? Hope you're well. I'm thinking about stereotypes this time. And this has been prompted by a couple of posts that I did this week, and also me attending a little bit of a gathering last weekend where I was there with a friend, female friend, and we sat on a table and there were a few other couples there. And that's the point. They all assumed that me and my friend were there as a couple, that we were together. And of course, when they asked the question and the curiosity got the better of them and they were starting to ask, what's the score with you two and so on. And we said, well, we're just friends and we've been friends for a long time. And then we started talking a little bit about our circumstances and situations and so on. You could see that the stereotyping cogs were whirring. And lo and behold, a whole bunch of other questions came flooding in our direction. It caused a good conversation, but afterwards the reflections were, wow, aren't we quick to stereotype and then make judgments? So I very quickly looked up the definition or a couple of dictionary definitions of stereotypes, and one that I found that I really like says, an often unfair and untrue belief that many people have about all people or things with a particular characteristic. Now, that really sort of resonated with me because I thought, do you know what? If I think back to my time working in dealerships and particularly in sales, we used to stereotype customers all the time. We used to make judgments about what people were wearing or the car they were driving or the colour of new car that they would choose or the type of customer that they were. And that's, of course, all stereotyping. Now, I've gone on to do more stuff around personality profiling, and I know that there is, varying traits and behavioural profiles for all of us. But I just think from that conversation and from that work in the profiling field, I think we have to be really, really careful on the whole profiling on the whole stereotyping thing. But we seem to all be conditioned and normalised that that's what we do, that we make a judgment based on someone's skin colour or their height or their weight or where they're from or what they drive or where they live or their sexuality or their marital status or the amount of money they've got. And the list goes on. So that then made me think, well, if we're talking about mental wealth and the people around us in our industry, and we do have a tendency, don't we, to attract people who are a bit like us. And I think the IMI's DEI task force has actually identified that homophily, which is the kind of art of recruiting in our own likeness, if you want to call it an art, that really does exist in our industry. And as a result, what we are inadvertently going to do is just keep perpetuating this whole thing about stereotypes. And like I said, we are all good at that. We all do it, and hands up, I've been guilty of that many times and probably still do it. And I've been picked up on my driving when I'm out and about, and some of the phrases and language that I use to describe other drivers on the road is rather stereotypical, I've got to say. So I'm not judging here and not preaching. I'm just saying, let's be aware of it. Because the other thing that can happen, and this what happened back at this party last weekend, was that as a result of that stereotyping, it did have a tendency to stifle conversation. And it did also have a tendency I could visibly see other people kind of being really uncomfortable and not wanting to participate for fear that they were also going to be stereotyped and judged and seen in a certain way. So, in short, if we want to create mental wealth and we want to get people opening up, and I'm doing more and more stuff now around particularly getting men talking and getting men opening up, because interestingly, and I did post this, there were 3 actual couples on this table. And when I started talking openly and honestly about working in mental health and my situation, my circumstances, there were 2 of the wives who actually nudged their husbands and said, why can't you be that honest? Why can't you be open like that? You've got stuff going on and you just won't talk to anyone. Now, it wasn't the environment to continue that conversation, but I thought that's fascinating, isn't it? That they're sitting there stereotyping other people, and yet they've got a whole load of stuff going on for themselves. And actually, it's the fear of being stereotyped that perhaps stops them from opening up and talking about it. So have a little bit of a think. As always, think about the people around you. Stand shoulder to shoulder. Is there a bit of stereotyping going on? Are you guilty of that? I know I have been and probably still do at times. And as always, if you want to have a chat, you know how to find me. stephen.witten@menable.org or all over that thing called LinkedIn. Take care, guys, and we will see you very soon. All the best.
So some great comments there from Steve, as ever, especially on the topic of stereotyping. And I was interested that there's actually a term, and I
did. Yeah.
I tried to write it down, but I didn't know how to spell it. But there is a term for recruiting in your own image.
Yes, and I think that does go on, doesn't it? I mean, that is a common thing because it's what you are comfortable with, and you're recruiting what people have the same mannerisms as yourself and same hobbies as yourself and things like this. So yeah, I think it's unfortunately, and I hate to say it, but the old automotive sector has probably been guilty of everything he's been saying there, hasn't it, over the
definitely
decades. I think it's changing, don't get me wrong, but I think the early days of automotive sector has always been that way, unfortunately. So
and Steve does make a good point that it's not just recruiting, it's people walking into your showroom as well. It's very easy to put them into a pigeonhole, and you just can't do that now.
Yeah, but as Steve said, if you do need to get a hold of him, then you can find him at menable.org or email him on Stephen, that's with a PHEN, .witten, WHITTON @menable.org, or as Stephen quite well says, that is all over the LinkedIn. So if you do need to talk to him about anything, then please do get in touch with Stephen there. So back to the headlines, Curtis. So over to fleet news. We're going right across the media today, aren't we?
We are, yes. We haven't had fleet news on for a little while, have we?
Half of company cars delivered in Q1 were fully electric. Now, this is saying that 49% of the company cars delivered in the first quarter of 2023 were battery electric vehicles, according to the latest data from the BVRLA, which is the British Vehicle Rental and Leasing Association, and saying that the high proportion of fully electric company cars detailed the latest in the Outlook report that they produced, that suggests that was thanks in part to the booming salary sacrifice market, which grew 41% year on year, with 91% of registrations being pure electric. So what's your thoughts on this one, Curtis?
Yeah, I thought this was fascinating. It's really good research, and it's good to see this data because, obviously we see the SMMT data on a month-by-month basis, and there is that split between business, fleet, and retail, but we haven't actually seen who's buying EVs. We see that EV sales are going up month on month, year on year, but we don't know which sectors they're going into. So this really does shed a light on what's happening. And it is interesting how the user choosers are driving part of this growth. I mean, it's not all of it, because the fleet sector also includes daily rental and leasing. And we know that there are incentives in place for rental companies and leasing companies to take EVs from manufacturers, because manufacturers are still supplying ICE vehicles to them. So there is something going on there. But I thought it was interesting that they actually point out that this is in stark contrast to what's happening in the retail market, where battery electric vehicle sales were responsible for 16% of new sales and 1% of used purchases, again over that first quarter.
Yeah, and Toby Poston, who is the director for corporate affairs at the BVLA, does he points out that we've had a two-tier transition to zero emission motoring for some time, and this growing gap between the fleet and the retail sector's appetite for decarbonisation could put the 2030 phase-out target in jeopardy. So, this is sort of saying that, it can't, I suppose where he's coming from this is, clearly the statistics for that Q1 the figures for Q1 clearly identify that the growth of battery electric vehicles is being driven by tax incentives, the benefiting kinds, the company car driver taxable benefits, and that is not sustainable going forward. We know that private registrations in the UK are on average around the 49, 50 to 51% of the overall registration market new. We know it's dropping down to close to the 40s as supply and demand starts to shift. But that doesn't align, if you think about an all EV and all hybrid market, with the figures we see here, because not all the market can be done by company car and benefiting kind drivers. So something has got to change around taxation and incentives. To Toby's point, we can't have this two-tier transition, particularly when it comes to private and fleet or new to used. And as you pointed out earlier, Curtis, yes, there's a lot of work from OEMs, and we call them batch deals, where the focus is trying to get these EVs into the market through various initiatives. But that's got to change, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. And Toby does actually mention a topic that we talk about on a regular basis, and that's the used EVs and the market dynamics there. So he does point out that, okay, these EVs that were registered in Q1 of this year, it will take them 3 to 4 years to filter through to the used car sector. And as he says, the last year has already shown an increasing imbalance between the fast-growing supply of used electric cars and demand that isn't keeping up. So we are seeing more of these EVs going into the used car sector, but the demand for them isn't there yet.
No, there's a lot to do. So we'll again, it's not going to be the last time we speak about this.
No.
We'll keep a close
revisit this one.
Exactly.
So next headline. Yeah, next headline is from AM Online, and it is Stellantis standards blamed for closure of Fiat Alpha cheap car dealership. So this is a Johnson's Cars site in Solihull, which the group confirmed in this story is closing. It's actually it's a very well located dealership because it's close to the M42. But under Stellantis's rules and regs, it looks as though it's not big enough for future requirements. And an interesting observation made in this story. So Johnson Cars, they're not pulling out of these franchises because they're sticking with larger sites in Swindon, which represents those Fiat Group FCA brands. But it does make the point that under the old Fiat Group, there was this drive towards putting these brands under the same roof. Made a lot of sense, coming from the same group, and sort of making the most of those sort of joint supplies, whatever. And now Stellantis is moving to maybe separate the brands and requires bigger premises. So they made the investment to put them under one roof, and now it looks as though they've got to make the investment to separate some of these brands.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, and I'm assuming that they went through a period where there was some dialogue when they started to put the multi-brands into that Solihull site at the time. I doubt that Johnson's would have just done it without some kind of discussion with FCA. So somebody's authorised for them brands to go under that one. And like you say, it was a strategic plan by the FCA group for multi-franchise, locations, that it made cost efficiency and strengthens the brand in that market. But yeah, it's interesting because obviously, I mean, Johnson's aren't a small group. I mean, Johnson's do have 58 sites in general, and they have 16 franchises across England. So it's no small group. But yeah, as you say, Curtis, having to forced to close that one down because it's not big enough for the multi-franchise, but allowing to keep the one in Swindon because that is much larger.
Yeah.
So obviously the FCA or Stellantis are quite happy with the multi-franchise approach, but obviously it's about size and scale that's now coming into play on this one. So yeah, it's a shame, but I'm sure we'll see much more of this as Stellantis move in terms of what their plans are moving forward.
And finally, this week, you'll enjoy this one, Phil. It's from the Daily Telegraph, and the headline is "Londoners buy up classic cars to dodge Sadiq Khan's ULEZ expansion." so talking about ongoing stories, yeah, we have talked about ULEZ a lot in recent weeks, and this really is an interesting story picked up by the Telegraph, because what they did was they spoke to a number of classic car dealers in and around London, and they've all noticed an uptake in interest, demand, and sales for cars that were built before 1983. And that's because 1983 is the qualifying year under the ULEZ terms for historic vehicles, which, of course, are exempt from the ULEZ charge. So, we talk a lot about unintended consequences, and this is surely one, because it means that these old cars, pre-1983, with higher emissions, are attracting a new audience, new buyers, rather than them getting into cleaner new cars, which would be ULEZ exempt. But of course, they're cheaper, they're more affordable. And when you're faced with a daily charge of £12.50, it doesn't take much to do the maths and work out that you're better off spending an awful lot less on an older car.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it does unintended consequences, because some of these older cars will clearly emit probably a higher level of carbon into the atmosphere. They're probably not the most efficient. They're certainly not Euro 5 and Euro 6 vehicles. So yeah, like you say, there's a few. It's a fantastic story. So if you can have a read of it in more detail, because it goes into some of the models, and there's a quote in here that they were speaking to somebody, a client, that had a couple of the W113, also known as the Pagoda, and one of them is ULEZ exempt, but the other one isn't. So I got two of these vehicles registered at different times that fall either side of the exemption period. So we know which one he's going to be getting out when he wants to go for a drive around London. And which one will probably go in for sale as try and move it out of the that sort of zoning area. So yeah, like you say, it's unintended consequences with this one, because that ramp up of dirty old classic pre-1983 vehicles, there's probably a hunt for those now that they'll start to go up in value. I mean, we've not talked about value increases on these things.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you mentioned values, because that Mercedes-Benz W123 that you mentioned. So looking at 1976 to 1986 models, they're currently going from between £2,500 to £5,000. So that's an awful lot of car for a low amount of outlay, and also within that £2,500 to £5,000 brand could buy you a Porsche 924 from 1976 to 1988, or a Jaguar XJS from 75 to 1996. But I was interested to see how some of the cars have actually shot up in value. So a 1970 Hillman Imp Super, £9,500, and the eye-watering one is a 1972 Austin Mini for £20,000.
I mean, yeah, you can see that, can't you? I mean, driving around London, easy to park, zipping in and out of the side streets, and not facing any fines for doing it. while I was pumping out probably some toxins out of the back of the petrol tailpipe, but we won't go there, Curtis. But yeah, you can see this one, can't you? Which I think, well, I mean, we talked about politics. We won't get into the politics, but obviously there is a nice little table which was produced by YouGov in this story that talk about the proportion of voters in favour of the ULEZ zone, and it splits down the Labour, Conservative, and Lib Dem. So yeah, I won't spoil that one. I'll let you take a look at the story yourself, and if I can take a screenshot and put it into the newsletter, I will do on Monday morning. But I'm sure you'll like that one.
Yeah, definitely. And the ULEZ extension actually comes into place the day after the bank holiday, so next Tuesday. So next time I'm up in London, I'll be looking out for Hillman Imps and Morris Miners.
But that's it for this week. I mean, some fantastic stories there, Curtis, that I think we've covered quite a few new media areas that we've not been to for a while. So, as I say, Monday morning, you'll get a copy of the headlines in your news feed. So if you haven't subscribed to that, then check out Motor Trade Radio podcast on LinkedIn. Subscribe to the news feed, and every Monday morning, if I get my dates right, I think I published it on Sunday last week, but something went wrong there. But on a Monday morning, normal, you'll get that into your news, your email and your news feed, and you'll get all the links to the stories we've covered and anything else we feel that relevant to share with you.
That's all for now, though. Many thanks for joining us on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. We're back next week with our chat with Darren Martin from Cap HBI, looking at how August panned out in terms of used car values. But until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
You've been listening to Motor Trade Radio Podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. We'll be sharing all the links from this week's headlines on Monday morning. So to make sure you receive them, just subscribe to the free newsletter on our LinkedIn page. Just search Motor Trade Radio Podcast.